If you study US law, politics, or government, and specifically the US Constitution, or even spend any amount of time watching American news, you'll see that two amendments that come up most frequently are the First and Second Amendment. These two are ones that really reflect a lot of the principles that the U.S. was founded upon, but are also somewhat controversial considering how they've been interpreted. Uh, Perhaps one of them more so than the other, especially in recent years. But I thought I would try explaining in a more clear and simple way how exactly they've been interpreted by the courts to give you an idea as to how they function in the US. Not really planning on sharing my personal opinion on this, but there will still be some controversial points showing up. But I'll just explain how people generally feel from perhaps a couple of different perspectives. The First Amendment promises you 5 freedoms and rights. Here's the full text if you want to read it. The 5 freedoms are speech, petition, religion, assembly, and press. First, it grants you, as an individual, the right to free speech, which is freedom from the government prohibiting you from speaking your mind on either government-owned property or your own private property. Now, this is where some of the controversial elements come from. Private citizens and corporations are not actually required to respect this right, only the government is. People are allowed to kick you off their property if they do not like your speech. Corporations as well. And corporations retain the right to do something very important in recent years. This has been a point of contention in recent years, with individuals complaining that corporations are censoring their speech, and therefore violating their right to free speech. But the corporations are quick to retort that the law only prohibits the government from taking such action. Media companies retain the right to limit what they host on their sites. Second is freedom of the press. This grants journalists and media outlets the right to report on the actions of government without fear of retaliation. There are a few exceptions where this right can be limited if it's in a case where the information being censored poses a national security threat. Make up your own mind whether you think this is a valid exercise of power or a thinly disguised way of allowing the government to exercise more power than it should. There are a few cases like that where people are granted certain rights or the government prohibited from doing certain things, except in certain extenuating circumstances. Again, those extenuating circumstances are often accused by more libertarian-leaning individuals and groups as being nothing more than thinly veiled ways of saying that you truly have no rights and the government can do whatever it wants. Whether you believe that these are genuinely good and necessary exercises of power, or a gross mockery of the concept of freedom and democracy, is really a matter for personal opinion. Though, in general, media outlets and journalists retain the right to report on the actions of government, including when the government does something bad. Third, assembly is the right of individual citizens to come together peacefully for purposes of discussing important topics, holding protests, rallies, and other social gatherings as forms of activism. Fourth is petition. People retain the right to ask the government to do things, whether this be to change laws, policies, or remove certain officials. Really anything that the government has the power to do, you retain the right to ask them to do it. Fifth is the freedom of religion. Now, this section also specifically prohibits the government from doing something, either making any law that favors any religion or creating its own religion. And of course, every individual inhabitant of the US is endowed with the right to practice whatever religion they so choose, so long as it does not harm those around them or violate any laws of the US. Next up is the Second Amendment, arguably the most controversial and heavily debated amendment in recent years. You may be surprised to learn that debate on the validity of civilian firearm ownership is actually a fairly recent phenomena. Quite simply, this grants every resident of the US the right to own a firearm. You may notice that the opening text discusses a militia, And that section of the text is also somewhat controversial, and there's some debate as to what that actually was intended to mean, but I'll elaborate on that in a minute. The federal government has generally followed a policy that each of the 50 states is allowed to regulate firearms within their own borders. There are, however, a few notable pieces of legislation passed by the federal government, such as laws prohibiting felons from owning firearms, or anyone besides those with special licenses from owning a fully automatic firearm. In addition to legislation, there's also a certain regulatory body, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or ATF. They do a couple of different things, which include, as you might guess, regulating firearms. This organization tends to be heavily criticized by gun rights advocates due to the arbitrary way in which they develop regulations, and in the way that they choose to, or not to, enforce them. What exactly I mean by that is beyond the scope of this explanation, but Wendigoon explains it in his Ruby Ridge video. Anyways, that bit in the beginning about maintaining a militia. There are many of those who believe that the wording, including the term militia, means that private citizens have the right to come together and form paramilitary groups free of any government control. The argument being that the Second Amendment was created to protect against a tyrannical government, largely the federal government, hence why state governments are permitted to maintain paramilitary forces. But then the question arises, what if the state governments become tyrannical? Then it would fall upon independently minded individual citizens to fight those who wield their power unjustly. They must then organize themselves into paramilitary forces to fight the oppressive government. Now, I think most individuals are capable of understanding their argument, but how has the government interpreted the amendment? While if my information is correct, there is no single federal law outlining the existence of a citizens' militia, every single one of the 50 states have passed laws outlining paramilitary or self-appointed paramilitary or law enforcement activity. So effectively it remains illegal, although actually prosecuting these groups has been kind of a few and far between. Before ending it off, I do want to go over one more argument that gun control advocates, so people who want to regulate firearms more, make use of. So this next argument is considered one of the most extreme, and I'll say has been largely rejected by courts. Essentially, it states that civilian firearm ownership was something that the Constitution and Second Amendment never actually guaranteed, and the entirety of the Second Amendment was only meant to grant states the right to maintain their own militias. A militia, when it's not a citizen's militia, being a military force of a state government. And while many states can and even do operate their own militia or National Guard forces to this day, courts have still interpreted the Second Amendment to mean that civilians can own firearms, albeit heavily regulated nowadays, but the point still stands. Private citizens, and even residents of the US, can own firearms.